Imagine for a second that you are the CEO of a massive global organization.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. We are talking about the ultimate monopoly here. You have been, the only game in town for over 1,000 years. You have branches in literally every village. Your logo is everywhere. And your customers are, well, they're everyone.
It's the kind of market dominance that modern tech companies can only dream of.
Exactly. But then, almost overnight, a competitor shows up. And they aren't just stealing a few customers here and there. They're tearing your entire business model apart.
Wow.
They're standing outside your branches telling people that your product is broken, that your management is totally corrupt, and your entire brand is a lie.
And the worst part is people are actually listening to them.
Right. You are hemorrhaging users. Revenues are tanking. You're facing an absolute existential crisis. So the question is, what do you do? Do you fold? Do you try to cut a deal, maybe merge with the competition? Or do you fight back?
It's the classic innovator's dilemma, but on a massive civilizational scale.
It really is. And today, we are diving into perhaps the biggest corporate turnaround story in human history. Only, it's not a corporation.
No, it's the Catholic Church.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are looking at the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation. We're fast-forwarding about 30 years after Martin Luther famously nailed those 95 Theses to the church door.
Right.
The Catholic Church is reeling. I mean, they've lost England, they've lost Scandinavia, they're losing Germany. And we are going to explore what historians call the Catholic Reformation. Or sometimes it's called the Counter-Reformation.
Exactly. And looking at the stack of research and historical analysis we have for today, our mission is really to understand a very specific two-pronged strategy.
Okay, lay it out for us.
Because the church didn't just panic and run. They launched a massive, highly coordinated campaign to fix their own internal corruption.
The first prong.
Right, while simultaneously doubling down hard on the very beliefs that the Protestants hated.
It's a fascinating mix of humility and absolute utter stubbornness. It really feels like the Empire Strikes Back.
In a way, yes. They realized they had to rebuild the Death Star, but maybe make sure the exhaust port wasn't quite so exposed this time around.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
But before we get to the whole fighting back part, we really have to understand the damage control. Because for you listening, this isn't just dusty history. This is a masterclass in institutional crisis management, branding, and honestly, it's the reason the map of Europe looks the way it does today.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this. Where does the comeback tour actually begin?
It begins in a boardroom. Or, well, more accurately, a cathedral in the city of Trent in northern Italy. This is the famous Council of Trent.
The Council of Trent. Now, looking at the timeline in our sources, this wasn't a quick weekend workshop where everyone brainstormed on a whiteboard, was it?
Far from it. It ran from 1545 to 1563.
Wait, really?
Yeah, that's 18 years. Off and on, of course, but 18 years.
18 years. That is a lot of meetings.
It was incredibly complex. Pope Paul III convened it because the church finally had to have a real hard look in the mirror moment.
They couldn't ignore the problems anymore.
Exactly. They realized that Martin Luther, despite being a heretic in their eyes, actually had a point about the administrative rot. The church had become bloated, very wealthy, and distracted.
So they were willing to admit they messed up on the operations side of things.
And administratively, yes. The sources emphasize that the first prong of their strategy was institutional reform. They essentially had to clean house. If you look at the complaints from the time, the corruption was just flagrant. It wasn't even hidden.
Okay, let's look at the laundry list here. What were the big scandals they finally decided to fix?
Well, first and foremost was simony.
Simony. That's the practice of buying and selling church officers. Like, I'll pay you 10,000 gold coins if you make my nephew a bishop.
Exactly that. It was rampant. You had noble families basically treating church positions like investment vehicles.
Wow.
You had people holding high office who had absolutely zero spiritual interest, just deep pockets. Some bishops didn't even live in the cities they were supposed to be leading.
They were absentee landlords.
Precisely. They were living it up in Rome or Paris, enjoying the tax revenue, while their flock was completely ignored. The Council of Trent officially ended that.
They just threw a line.
They said, no more, you cannot buy your way into leadership, and if you are a bishop, you have to actually live in your diocese.
That seems like a pretty low bar for a religious leader, but I guess it really needed to be said.
It really did. Then they tackled clerical discipline. There were endless complaints from the public about priests who were, let's say, morally loose.
Right, the celibacy issue. I assume this was a major PR disaster for them.
Huge. You have to remember, The priest is supposed to be the direct conduit to God for the average person. If he has a secret wife and 3 kids in the village next door, it completely undermines the whole system.
It makes them look like massive hypocrites.
Exactly. So Trent strictly reinforced the rule of celibacy. If you are a priest, you are married to the church. Period. No secret families, no mistresses.
That makes sense for their brand.
But they went further, actually. They established seminaries for the first time.
Wait, there weren't seminaries before this?
Not really. Before Trent, priest training was very ad hoc. You might apprentice with an older priest, but there was no standardized curriculum.
Just kind of learning on the job?
Yeah. Trent said, no, we need a professional, educated, highly disciplined clergy. They needed to restore moral authority because the Protestants were just hammering them on it.
Now here's the big one I want to clarify, because I think a lot of people get this wrong when they learn about this era. Indulgences.
Ah, yes. The spark that started the whole fire.
Right. Luther hated indulgences. Basically paying money to the church to reduce your time in purgatory. Did the Council of Trent actually get rid of them?
This is where it gets super fascinating. No, they did not.
Really? Even though that was literally the main complaint.
Yeah.
That seems like a massive oversight on their part.
It wasn't an oversight at all. It was a very strategic choice. They didn't abolish the theology of indulgences, the idea that the church has the spiritual authority to grant remission of punishment for sin.
Right.
But they cleaned up the practice. They mandated that the funds gathered couldn't be used for the Pope's personal gain or extravagant building projects anymore.
So it's like saying, we can still grant forgiveness, but we aren't going to use the money to build a fancy new swimming pool.
Essentially, yes. They kept the core doctrine, but removed the financial abuse that made it look like a cheap transaction. And that distinction leads us perfectly into the second prong of the strategy.
Which is the line in the sand.
Correct. While they were willing to fix the behavior, the corruption, the laziness, the greed, they refused to budge a single inch on the theology itself.
This is the part that genuinely surprises me. You'd think if you're losing millions of followers to a competitor, you might try to compromise on the product features to win some of them back.
You'd think so.
You know, like, okay, maybe we can meet you halfway on the whole faith alone thing. Let's make a deal.
And that is exactly what they didn't do. The Council of Trent was a total reaffirmation of Catholic dogma. They looked at everything the Protestants were saying, and they essentially said, you are wrong and we are right.
Wow.
They viewed the church not as a democracy or a market responder trying to win back a demographic, but as the sole custodian of absolute truth. You simply don't compromise on truth.
Let's play a little game of comparison here, just so you listening can see how stark this divide really was. Because I think in the modern world, we sometimes gloss over these theological differences.
Sounds good.
I'll take the Protestant argument, what Luther and Calvin were shouting from the rooftops, and you tell me what the Council of Trent decided.
I am ready.
Okay, round one. Salvation. The Protestants said salvation comes through faith alone. You can't earn it, you just have to believe.
Right.
What did Trent say?
Trent said, faith and works. They argued that faith alone was actually dangerous because it implied you could do whatever terrible things you wanted as long as you believed.
Oh, I see.
Trent insisted that your actions, your charity, and your participation in the rituals of the church absolutely matter for your salvation. You have to actively cooperate with grace.
Okay, round two. Authority. The Protestants said sola scriptura, the Bible alone, is the ultimate authority. If it's not in the book, we don't do it.
Trent doubled down hard against that.
Yeah.
They declared that church dogma and tradition are equal in authority to the Bible.
Equal.
Equal. Their argument was historical. The church existed before the Bible was officially compiled. The church gave us the Bible, so that your church's interpretation is the final word.
That is a massive difference. It basically shuts down any argument starting with, but the Bible says if the church tradition says otherwise.
Exactly. It completely centralizes power back to the institution.
Okay, round three. The sacraments. Protestants generally cut it down to two, right? Baptism and communion.
The Catholic Church affirmed all 7. Baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, penance, anointing of the sick, holy orders, and matrimony.
But they kept everything.
They weren't letting go of the ritual structure that accompanied a person from birth to death. They wanted the church intimately involved in every major life moment.
And finally, the big theological sticking point. The Eucharist. The bread and the wine.
This was the ultimate deal breaker. Protestants had various views, but generally rejected the idea of a literal physical change.
Right.
The Council of Trent reaffirmed transubstantiation.
For those who might not know that term, can you define that clearly?
Transubstantiation is the specific belief that during the Mass, the substance of the bread and wine actually changes into the body and blood of Christ.
So not a metaphor.
Not symbolically, literally. It looks like bread, tastes like bread, but the underlying substance is Christ. Trent said if you deny this, you are anathema.
Which basically means cursed, right?
Yes, officially excommunicated and cursed.
So stepping back, what does this all mean for the average European in, say, 1560?
It meant the divorce was permanent. By drawing this hard line, the church made reconciliation utterly impossible. There was no big tent Christianity anymore. You were either Catholic or you were Protestant. The middle ground was completely scorched earth.
So they fixed the corruption, but they hardened the heart of the doctrine.
Yes.
But a policy paper, even an 18-year-long one, doesn't change the world on its own. You need people to actually go out and sell it. You need a marketing team.
You need boots on the ground.
Right. Which moves us to our next segment, the new religious orders. If the Council of Trent was the boardroom strategy, these guys were the special forces deployed to execute it out in the field.
And the most famous of these special forces were undoubtedly the Jesuits.
The Society of Jesus, founded by Ignatius of Loyola. Now, Ignatius wasn't your typical soft-spoken priest, was he?
Not at all. Ignatius is such a key figure here. He wasn't a theologian sitting in an ivory tower. He was a former soldier.
A military man.
Right. He was severely injured in battle, took a cannonball to the leg, and he had a massive spiritual awakening while he was recovering. And he brought that intense military discipline into the spiritual life.
How did that look in practice?
The Jesuits weren't like the older contemplative orders that stayed inside monasteries praying all day. They were highly active. They were out in the world on the front lines.
And their main weapon wasn't a sword, it was a book.
Exactly. Education. The Jesuits figured out something brilliant. The absolute best defense against Protestantism is a smart, well-educated Catholic.
Makes sense.
They believed that if people truly understood the depth and the logic of Catholic theology, they wouldn't fall for what the church considered the simplistic arguments of the Protestants.
So they started building schools.
The finest schools in all of Europe. They taught rhetoric, logic, astronomy, languages, and they demanded absolute, unquestioning loyalty to the papacy.
They really were the Pope's shock troops.
Intellectually speaking, yes, they could debate a Protestant theologian under the table, but they were also incredible missionaries. They went to the Americas, they went to Asia. They were playing a global game to restore the church's influence.
It's interesting. It's almost like they realized they might lose Northern Europe for good, so they just decided to go win the rest of the world instead.
That's a very accurate assessment of their geopolitical strategy. They simply expanded the map.
Now, we often hear a lot about the Jesuits, but our sources highlight another group that I think gets unfairly overlooked, the Ursulines.
Yes, and it's crucial we don't skip this part. The Ursulines were a female religious order, and their focus was very similar to the Jesuits' education, but specifically for young girls.
Which, strategically speaking, seems like absolute genius for the long term.
It's incredibly high leverage. Think about the social structure of the 16th century. If you educate the girls, you are educating the future mothers. And who is the primary spiritual teacher within the family unit? The mother. By ensuring women were deeply grounded in Catholic doctrine, the Ursulines were securing the loyalty of the next generation before those kids could even read a Protestant pamphlet.
It's playing the ultimate long game. They were embedding the doctrine into the very fabric of the family.
Absolutely. It was a brilliant bottom-up approach to complement the Jesuits' more top-down intellectual approach.
There's one more figure we have to mention in this renewal phase. St. Teresa of Avila. Now, she wasn't an educator in the same way, right? She was more of a mystic.
She was a Carmelite nun, and her role was different, but just as vital to the survival of the church. Remember how the Protestants claimed the Catholic Church was spiritually dead?
Right, that it was all just about gold and political power and empty rituals. That was a huge part of Luther's critique.
Yeah.
That the structure had essentially eaten the spirit.
Teresa of Avila blew that argument entirely out of the water. She led a massive reform of the Carmelite order that completely rejected all that luxury and affluence.
She went back to the basics.
She went back to strict poverty, intense prayer, and deep, deep mysticism. She spoke and wrote extensively about having a direct, profoundly personal relationship with God.
Which is funny because that's something the Protestants claimed the Catholic Church discouraged.
Exactly. She provided a living, breathing counter-narrative. She proved that you could be fiercely Catholic and still be deeply, authentically spiritual. She showed that the church still had a soul.
She led by example.
Her writings on prayer and her personal example reinvigorated the inner life of the church. It gave ordinary people a reason to stay that wasn't just political or out of habit. It was deeply emotional and spiritual.
So we have the boardroom fixing the rules at Trent. We have the special forces, the Jesuits and the Ursulines educating the masses. And we have the mystics restoring the soul of the church. It sounds like a pretty positive, uplifting campaign so far.
It was incredibly effective. But we have to be honest here. It wasn't just education and prayer. There was a much darker side to the Counter-Reformation.
The thought police.
If you want to call it that, yes. The church realized that persuasion and good examples weren't always enough. Sometimes they felt they needed strict enforcement.
We're talking about the Roman Inquisition.
Yes. Now, the Inquisition had existed in various local forms before this, but during this period, it was strengthened and highly centralized right under the Pope in Rome. It was an internal policing mechanism. The goal was to root out heresy.
That heresy basically just meant disagreeing with the Council of Trent.
Correct. It was designed to ensure that absolutely everyone, from the highest bishop to the lowest peasant, stuck strictly to the rules.
No exceptions.
No exceptions. It was about consolidating Catholic identity by actively suppressing any dissenting voices. If you are caught spreading Protestant ideas in Italy or Spain, the Inquisition was actively looking for you.
It creates a culture of fear, obviously, but also a culture of intense uniformity.
And that uniformity was the primary goal. They needed a solid, unified front to fight the Protestants.
But they didn't just police people in the streets, they policed ideas. This is where we get the index of prohibited books.
The Index Librorum Prohibitorum, this was the ultimate do-not-read list.
And this wasn't just a list of Martin Luther's greatest hits, was it?
Oh, no. It was incredibly comprehensive. Obviously, it included Luther and Calvin and the other major reformers, but it went much, much further than theology.
Who else was on it?
They banned works by Erasmus, who was actually a loyal Catholic humanist. And later on, they famously banned works by scientists like Galileo.
That seems like a strange turning point. I mean, why ban Galileo? He's talking about stars and planets, not sacraments. Why pick a fight with science?
Because the church wanted to remain the ultimate arbiter of truth, period. Whether that truth was theological or scientific, they saw these new ideas that challenged the traditional earth-centric understanding of the universe as dangerous threats to the established order.
I guess if the church could be wrong about the sun and the earth, people might ask what else they could be wrong about.
Exactly. It's a slippery slope. By creating the index, the church was trying to insulate the Catholic population from the scientific revolution and the Reformation simultaneously.
It's a really bold move, basically saying, we will tell you what is true, and we will physically prevent you from even seeing the alternative.
It creates a bubble, a very secure, very unified bubble, but a bubble nonetheless. It signaled that the church was prioritizing sheer obedience and strict orthodoxy over open intellectual inquiry.
So let's zoom out here as we wrap up. We've got the administrative reforms, the new religious orders, and the heavy censorship. What is the actual legacy of all this? When the dust finally settles in the 17th century, what does Europe look like?
Well, the most obvious legacy is the map itself. We call it the confessional divide. The Reformation and the Catholic response basically froze the borders of religion in Europe.
So Southern Europe stayed Catholic and Northern Europe went Protestant.
Generally, yes. Italy, Spain, France, Austria, they remained firmly in the Catholic camp, largely thanks to the Inquisition and the Jesuits holding the line.
And the North.
Northern Germany, Scandinavia, England, they were gone. The split was permanent. There was no putting the continent back together.
But the church itself, as an institution, it survived the crisis.
It did much more than just survive. It revitalized. That's really the key takeaway from our sources today. In 1520, it looked like the Catholic Church might literally collapse under the weight of its own corruption. People were predicting the absolute end of the papacy.
Right. It was that dire.
But by 1600, it was streamlined, it was confident, and it was expanding globally at a massive rate.
So the two-pronged strategy actually worked.
In terms of institutional survival, absolutely it worked. By fixing the glaring abuses like simony and focusing on personal devotion like St. Teresa championed, they stopped the bleeding.
He saved the brand.
They kept their status as a major political and cultural power. They leveraged that incredible education and missionary work to remain a dominant force in world history for centuries to come.
It's really amazing to think about. They managed to completely pivot a thousand-year-old institution in the span of just a few decades.
It is remarkable. They accepted they had lost the North, but they heavily fortified the South and prepared themselves for the modern era.
Okay, let's quickly recap the journey today. The Catholic Church faces a massive existential competitor in Protestantism. They muted Trent, they cleaned up the money scandals, but they draw a hard, uncompromising line on the theology.
Right.
They send out the Jesuits to outsmart the opposition and the Ursulines to raise the next generation. And then they use the Inquisition and the Index to make sure absolutely no one steps out of line.
A very comprehensive strategy of reform, defense, and control.
It's a lot to digest for one sitting.
It is. And there's one final thought I want to leave you with, looking at that tension we discussed between their different methods.
What's that?
Consider the central paradox of this whole strategy. On one hand, the Church used the Jesuits to champion education. They were actively expanding the mind, teaching logic, rhetoric, and astronomy. They genuinely wanted their followers to be the smartest people in the room.
Right, the intellectual elite.
But on the exact same hand, they used the index of prohibited books to close the mind, to ban literature and censor thinkers like Galileo.
That is a huge contradiction. Like, be
Yeah.
incredibly smart, but whatever you do, don't look over there.
Exactly. It raises a fascinating question for any large institution, even today. How do you balance the desire to create highly educated, smart followers with the very real need to prevent them from thinking dangerous thoughts?
That's tough.
The Catholic Reformation suggests that in the battle for hearts and minds, information is the most dangerous weapon of all. And sometimes you try to wield it by sharpening it, and other times by completely hiding it.
That is definitely something to think about. A huge thank you to everyone for listening to this deep dive into the Catholic Reformation.
Keep asking questions.
And always stay curious. We'll see you next time.